7 May 1945. Inside a seized German estate near Frankfurt, the war in Europe had officially ended. Celebrations echoed outside the walls. Yet General George S. Patton sat rigid across from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, carrying words that would fracture their bond, reshape his fate, and echo across history. Germany had surrendered only hours earlier. American troops flooded the streets with relief, champagne, and song, but Patton felt no sense of triumph, because in his mind the real danger was only beginning. He leaned forward, his voice low and controlled, and told Eisenhower a truth he believed could not wait, a truth that would soon cost him everything. "We are going to fight them sooner or later," Patton said, choosing each word carefully, his eyes locked on his commander, his meaning unmistakable. "Let us do it now, while our army is intact, organized, and capable of winning." He was not speaking of Germany, not of the defeated Reich, but of the Soviet Union, the very ally with whom Eisenhower had spent 3 years coordinating victory over Hitler. Eisenhower stared back in silence, absorbing the weight of what he was hearing, because the American public adored Stalin, the press praised the Red Army, and the wartime alliance was still treated as sacred. "George, you don't understand politics," Eisenhower replied quietly, trying to end the discussion, trying to close the future. "The war is finished, and the country is going home." In that moment, Patton realized something chilling and irreversible, because Eisenhower knew the danger was real, yet would do nothing to confront it. What followed became one of the most consequential silences in American military history, a silence that allowed a new conflict to take shape in plain sight. Patton had recognized the Soviet threat before Washington would admit it existed. He had proposed action while American power was unmatched, and he was dismissed by leaders who feared public opinion more than strategic reality. The Third Army had advanced farther than any other Allied force. Patton's armor had driven deep into Germany. His spearhead stood near Czechoslovakia, and everywhere he went he saw the same disturbing pattern. The Red Army was not liberating Eastern Europe, it was occupying it with ruthless efficiency, and American veterans hardened by years of combat were stunned by what they witnessed. Intelligence reports described mass rape, systematic looting, and summary executions, carried out against civilians suspected of opposing communism. Entire communities vanished eastward, loaded onto trains bound for Soviet labor camps, erased from history without record or mercy. In April 1945, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice, struggling to contain his anger, struggling to describe the danger forming before him. "I have no particular desire to understand them," he wrote, "except to determine how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. The Russians give me the impression of something that will be feared in future world political reorganization." What Patton witnessed firsthand, diplomats in Washington refused to acknowledge, because the Soviet Union was not a temporary partner, it was a totalitarian empire expanding westward under the cover of victory. While politicians trusted promises of free elections and democratic governance, Patton met American prisoners freed from Soviet custody, men who described treatment worse than what they endured under the Germans. Their watches, boots, and rations were stolen, protests were met with beatings or bullets, and the reports grew darker by the day. German factories were dismantled piece by piece, entire industrial plants shipped east, while communist puppet regimes were installed in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Anti-communist resistance fighters, who had battled the Nazis for years, were arrested, executed, or erased without ceremony. By May 1945, Patton had assembled a concrete plan, not emotional outbursts, but a serious military proposal grounded in intelligence and battlefield reality. His analysis was brutally direct, because the Red Army had lost 27 million people, its forces were exhausted, overstretched, and dependent on captured supplies. Their supply lines extended thousands of miles back to Russia, fragile and exposed, while American forces stood at peak readiness with total air superiority. "We could defeat the Russians in 6 weeks, Patton told Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson, his confidence rooted in logistics rather than bravado. The Soviet Union lacked strategic bombing capability, its anti-aircraft defenses were thin, and American air power alone could cripple Soviet logistics. Soviet tank numbers were impressive on paper, yet years of relentless combat had left them mechanically unreliable and difficult to sustain. American M4 Shermans were lighter and less armored, but they were dependable, plentiful, and backed by unmatched industrial output. Most critically, Patton believed Soviet morale was brittle, because soldiers had been told they were liberating their homeland, not conquering foreign populations. If American forces advanced east, Patton believed large numbers would surrender or desert rather than fight another war. He went further, proposing the unthinkable, suggesting that rearmed German soldiers could be used against their former occupiers. There are hundreds of thousands who would rather fight the Russians than rot in prison camps, Patton argued, his logic cold and uncompromising. Washington was horrified, because the United States had just defeated Germany, yet Patton's reasoning was painfully clear. German soldiers feared the Soviets far more than the Americans, and hatred makes for fierce alliances. "I would rather have a German division beside me than a Soviet one," Patton wrote, a statement that would soon leak and explode. Eisenhower rejected the proposal publicly for reasons of demobilization, exhaustion, and logistics, but those were not the real obstacles. The true barrier was political survival, because President Truman continued Roosevelt's policy of cooperation, and the post-war framework had already been agreed upon. Proposing war with the Soviets would have meant accusations of warmongering, betrayal, and madness, and Eisenhower knew it would end his career. He also believed diplomacy could restrain Stalin, that institutions like the United Nations could manage rivalry, and that time would ease tensions. This was the dividing line between the two men, because Eisenhower trusted process and politics, while Patton trusted force and opportunity. "George sees the world as a battlefield," Eisenhower told his staff, "and does not understand that we must live with these people." Patton was not alone. Winston Churchill had reached the same conclusion, shaped by decades of experience and memories of 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power. By April 1945, Churchill was urgently urging Western leaders to push east before Soviet control hardened. He wanted Berlin, Prague, and Vienna secured before the Red Army arrived. "An iron curtain is descending across their front," Churchill warned Truman on 12 May 1945, introducing a phrase that would define an era. He soon authorized Operation Unthinkable, a detailed plan to force Soviet withdrawal from Eastern Europe using Allied forces and rearmed German units. British chiefs of staff concluded the plan was feasible if launched immediately, though it required total commitment and enormous risk. Truman rejected it outright, appalled by the idea of another war and the rearming of German forces. When Patton learned of Churchill's proposal, he felt vindicated, believing at least one leader understood the scale of the threat. The press, once Patton's champion, turned on him quickly, as leaked remarks were framed as recklessness and instability. Columnists questioned his sanity, editors criticized his judgment, and none reported the atrocities his intelligence officers documented. By August 1945, pressure mounted to remove him, and a press conference remark about denazification provided the excuse. On 28 September 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command, officially for political remarks, unofficially for refusing to stay silent. In his final months, Patton wrote warnings that read like prophecy, urging strength, readiness, and resolve. "If we disarm now," he warned, "we will have won the war, but lost the peace." On 9 December 1945, Patton was gravely injured in a car accident near Mannheim, paralyzed from the neck down. He died on 21 December 1945, 60 years old, leaving behind unanswered questions and unheeded warnings. What he predicted unfolded with grim precision. As Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain, elections vanished, and repression became policy. From 1945 to 1989, communist regimes killed or imprisoned millions, validating Patton's fears. The Cold War he hoped to prevent lasted 45 years, consumed trillions, and scarred generations. Patton's tragedy was not madness, but timing, because he was right before the world was ready to admit it. His voice endures as a reminder that truth is often unwelcome, prophets are often silenced, and strategic windows close forever. History answered the question of whether he identified the threat correctly, because everything he warned about came to pass. Whether acting then was possible remains debated, but that the cost of waiting was enormous is beyond dispute.